are more like conversations than stilted talking heads. So please, if you like what we're saying, we have opened up the reactions. So clap your hands, thumbs up, love what we're saying if you like that. And chat function is open. So please, while you're coming online, let us know where you're from. Really interesting to see all the parts of the world. The GGA operates now in 167 countries. So you won't be alone, whichever part of the world you're in today. If you have got specific questions for the audience, we will be taking a Q&A towards the end of the event. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and then if we don't get to them, we can always get to them afterwards and place the answers on the event page. Don't forget that the recording will be available on the event page, as well as highlight summaries, vocal voice briefs, podcast style summaries. We really try and make all of these events very consumable. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I'd like to then welcome our two guests. The chair of the task force is Ruwaida, and the co-chair is Fazana. Really happy to have them here today. But we got some special news. And of course, since the last webinar and this one, we have launched the recommendations. So I will pop that into the link into the chat so that you can download the recommendations. But let's see a little bit more about the launch. And Dudu, over to you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and welcome once again to everyone. We're delighted today to show you the overview of the B20's the Integrity and Compliance Task Force. And as Carolyn has just mentioned, that our chair and co-chair will be hosting us today and really focusing on the third recommendation, which is really on amplifying collective action and integrity standards for inclusive growth. So please enjoy this short clip. It's a 2-minute clip that will really focus on what the key message that our chair shared.
No economy can thrive without trust, and trust begins with responsible business conduct. That is why the Integrity and Compliance Task Force, led by Ruwaida Redfern, CEO of Deloitte Africa, has taken on the critical challenge of combating corruption and strengthening ethical standards across sectors.
Corruption can undermine public trust, stifle growth, distort markets, and deter investment. The Integrity and Compliance Task Force focused on developing actionable proposals to help strengthen compliance systems, expand cross-border cooperation, and harness technology to detect and prevent misconduct. The recommendations were shaped by 3 key themes: leveraging technology in integrity and anti-corruption measures, strengthening integrity embedment in climate and sustainability finance systems, and amplifying collective action and integrity standards for inclusive growth.
The 7th of our 8 B20 South Africa task forces turns its attention.
Great, thank you so much. That was it, right, Dudu?
It is indeed. I did see a couple of comments saying the volume was not as high, so we will try and share the clip after the session.
I'll do that. Thank you, Dudu. And of course, our first 2 webinars, we're talking about the first 2 recommendations around the technology and the other recommendation. But today, it's all about the third recommendation. So without delaying on that, I'd first of all like to talk about this policy action 3. 3.1 says expanding and embedding public-private partnerships, PPP, as a tool to promote integrity and drive inclusive growth. The B20 recommendation talks about inclusive growth. So I'd first of all like to ask Ruwaida and then Fazana, so how does corruption then undermine this inclusive growth, and how can we use partnerships and collective action to address both that and also to ensure that everyone benefits?
So thank you, Carolyn, for the question. And let me just start by saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I see lots of chatter on the group, and I can see that there are people from around the world. It's wonderful to be here with you virtually and to share the work that has been done by the B20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force. So let's just start with the first piece. How does corruption actually undermine inclusive growth? Corruption is repeatedly identified in the B20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force policy paper as a critical barrier to inclusive growth. It is not just a matter of lost money or missed opportunity. It distorts markets, it erodes trust, and it widens inequality. So firstly, corruption distorts markets and competition. It creates an uneven playing field where contracts and opportunities may go to those who are actually willing to bribe or use connections, and not necessarily those with the best products, services, or ideas. Secondly, corruption itself then erodes trust. When people and businesses perceive that the system is rigged, trust in institutions and markets is severely undermined. And what this does is that it reduces participation and it can undermine the legitimacy of both governments and businesses. The third point I want to make is that corruption may actually worsen inequality. We know that it disproportionately harms the most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable are small businesses, marginalized communities, and those without connections. And it does so by diverting resources away from public services and infrastructure that actually support broad-based development. And finally, corruption can reduce investment and it can reduce growth. We know that investors are likely to commit capital, in environments where corruption is, they're less likely to commit capital in environments where corruption is widespread. And what this does is that it leads to fewer jobs, less innovation, and slows down economic growth. And just, by way of statistics, the 2024 Corruption Perception Index, and according to this index, it tells that two-thirds of the 180 countries that were surveyed scored between 50 on a 100-point scale, where 0 is the most corrupt and 100 is the least corrupt. So two-thirds of the 180 countries scored below 50. But there is a way forward. The B20 Integrity and Compliance policy paper states that expanding and embedding public-private partnerships, or PPPs, and amplifying collective action are important tools to promote integrity and to drive inclusive growth. So why are partnerships so powerful? Really, because corruption is too complex for any one actor to tackle alone. And what we need is multi-stakeholder collaboration, bringing together government, business, and civil society. And what this does is that it helps level the playing field and strengthens credibility and supports vulnerable market actors. So this collective action approach is far more effective than isolated efforts. PPPs often blend public oversight with private sector initiative, creating flexible frameworks that can adapt to local realities and help shape regulation. And by working together, stakeholders can set higher integrity standards, share best practices, and create industry-wide norms that make corruption harder to hide. So Carolyn, let me pause there and perhaps we can bring Fazana into the conversation, and then I can talk a little bit more about how PPPs themselves could promote integrity and inclusive growth.
Absolutely, because we've seen so much work around PPPs being done in municipalities and at provincial level, and I'm sure in multiple countries. In fact, one of the organizations that the Good Governance Academy works is the World Association or Alliance for PPPs, which tries to make and professionalize that practice. But let's bring in Fazana. Fazana, if you could add to the conversation, please.
Sure.
Oh,
So,
need to highlight you. Just a second, I just need to highlight you. Okay, carry on.
okay. Can you hear me okay?
All good, thank you.
Great. So good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I couldn't be in South Africa, but I am in the south of Saudi Arabia, called Jazan. And today is Saudi National Day. And in a small tribute to my roots in South Africa, I'm wearing a traditional outfit from the southern region of Saudi Arabia. Thank you, Carolyn and Rueda and Dudu, for inviting me to this panel. It's an honor to be on this panel to discuss Policy Action 3. The B20 recommends talks about inclusive growth, which is a necessary goal, but as we know, corruption acts as a formidable wall blocking the path to inclusive and genuine prosperity. So in my previous life, I was a forensic investigator for a competitor of Rueda's, PwC. I was part of the team that investigated South Africa's infamous arms deal. And what I witnessed firsthand was how a seemingly routine process around procurement was weaponized for large-scale corruption. I'll give you an example. So there was a company that was technically the best and offered the most competitive price, but they weren't willing to participate in backroom deals. So the procurement team didn't want to qualify them because they wanted to qualify the company that was willing to participate in a backroom deal. So what they did is they manipulated the procurement process by adding a premium to the bid. So where, for example, the bid was 20 million rands, they created a fictitious requirement to add a premium, which resulted in that bid being inflated to, for example, to 40 million rands, which eliminated their competitive edge. This manipulation was facilitated by a few rogue employees in the government departments, and I saw this happening over and over again in my career. Another example was when I was in Kenya, and I was part of the investigation team investigating Anglo Leasing, which, as my Kenyan friends will know, was a huge scandal. And in this case, high-level ministers and government employees used the procurement system to buy goods and services at inflated prices or that weren't even needed, simply to siphon off funds, right? So they used the process to facilitate their criminal schemes. How do we combat this? What can governments and private sector do to fight corruption and help ensure everyone benefits from economic development? And for me, the answer lies in PPPs, public-private partnerships, as well as collective action. These aren't just buzzwords, right? They are a crucial mechanism for bringing together governments, private companies, civil society to address a problem that no single entity can solve alone. I'll give you an example of what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Under Vision 2030, there is a procurement system called Etimad, which uses technology to increase transparency in public finance. So it's an e-government platform that standardizes and digitizes government procurement, budgeting, and payment processes into a single unified portal, right? So it increases transparency, but most importantly, it minimizes human interaction and the opportunity for bribery and manipulation. And it reduces the chance of these secret deals that was happening in the arms deal as well as the Anglo Leasing matters. In South Africa, we do have a similar system, the e-tenders procurement platform, which should be serving a similar purpose. And across the world, especially in the G20 countries, we have, for example, Korea has CONAPS, and Brazil has gone one step further. They've got, it's called the ALICE program, where it's an AI system developed by the Comptroller General's office, I think similar to our Auditor General, that analyzes thousands of public procurement processes to identify red flags and potential irregularities that warrant a closer look from the auditors. Mexico also has a social witness initiative that allows civil society as well as business representatives to provide feedback on the bidding process for major contracts. But apart from these digital tools, which I think is a powerful, it's a powerful mechanism to help mitigate corruption risks, we also need institutional safeguards. I know in South Africa we had carte blanche, very depressing program on a Sunday evening. But we also have, like in Saudi Arabia, we've got our oversight and anti-corruption authority called Nazaha, which is the government body for combating corruption. So while it's a public entity, its success relies heavily on collective action. It needs the citizens and companies to report corruption, and it's empowered us to become active participants. When I first came to Saudi Arabia, one of my first text messages was from Nazaha. And it was in Arabic, so I was a bit terrified as to why was I receiving a text message from Nazaha. But it's a message all citizens receive on a monthly basis regarding the number of corruption cases being investigated, the government entities that are being investigated, how many prosecutions are taking place, etc. So it's a constant reminder of the action that's being taken, and it's something I would suggest other countries also also implementing. It would be like a reminder coming from the hawks or the scorpions. My generation will remember the scorpions. So it's an excellent practice, as I say, which I think other companies can adopt. So in conclusion, I think, as Rueda has said, the fight against corruption is not a solo endeavor. It requires governments to create transparent tech-enabled systems, private companies to demand ethical behavior, and citizens to be empowered as watchdogs. And through these strong public-private partnerships and collective action, we can definitely build a world where procurement is a tool for progress and not corruption.
Thank you so much. I've put a link there in terms to Nazaha. I think that's the right link. Nazaha. Thank you so much for the insights. I think those are, it's incredible to have case studies so that we can actually refer to, things that are meaningful and, just to give us a context. And as you say, that top of mind reminder, when you come into the country, hey, this is how we do things, and it's not corruption based, and we do need to be very on top of this. There was a comment in the chat function about, but it's not only government, it's the private sector as well. Of course, and I think that's where the PPP really comes in. And that talks to this policy action too, strengthening support and incentives for organizations to engage and drive collective action for inclusive growth. And that's really around, the inclusive growth, but we're going to get to the PPP. I'm going to ask the two of you, once a collective action is underway, how do we know that it's actually working? And what is the best way to measure the impact of our anti-corruption efforts? So I think that's always the difficulty, is that, we see it's difficult to find corruption, to point it out. And when it's pointed out, it's always after the fact. And it's, so the impact's already been had. So what should we be looking at? What are those key performance indicators that we do need to be looking out for? So really the question is, how do we know that it's actually working, our measures? And what is the best way to measure the impact of those anti-corruption measures? Rueda, can I start with you on that one?
So Carolyn, the B20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force recognizes that measuring the impact of collective action is important. And it's important not only for accountability, but also to ensure that our anti-corruption initiatives deliver real and lasting change. So the first step, I believe, is to set clear, measurable objectives. Collective action initiatives should begin with a shared vision, whether it is reducing bribery incidents or increasing transparency, improving compliance rates, or enhancing trust among stakeholders. We need to land on what is the common vision that everyone is working towards. I do believe that key performance indicators or KPIs are necessary. So, for example, the B20 task force tracks the percentage of G20 companies that are actively engaging in collective action initiatives. And, in doing so, what we're trying to do is to aim to increase the number of countries who are engaging in collective action from 51.52%, so just over half of the G20 countries are engaging in collective action in 2025. And we want to get to 100% of all countries, engaging in such initiatives by 2030. So this KPI, really provides a tangible benchmark for progress and for impact. Secondly, the number and diversity of organizations involved should also be tracked. And this includes SMMEs, civil society, and government. It is important to measure the frequency and the quality of meetings, workshops, and training sessions. However, it's not enough to count activities. We also need to evaluate the outcomes. In other words, are corruption risks actually being reduced? Are new anti-corruption policies, procurement reforms, or transparency mechanisms being adopted as a result of this, collective action initiative? Surveys, audits, and incident reportings are used to assess whether bribery, fraud, or other risks are decreasing. The policy and process changes should be documented, and real-world examples where collective action has led to tangible improvements should be highlighted. And I think Frizana did an excellent job in highlighting, some of her lived examples of this. Consider again the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, or MACN, for example, and they really work towards eliminating forms of maritime, or, SAMLET in South Africa, and they really bring together the banking sector and government regulators to enhance collaboration and coordination to reduce financial crime. Another example is the Proetica program in Brazil, and they publicly recognize organizations that voluntarily adopt these integrity measures. So if the company successfully passes this evaluation phase, it is then awarded the title of Proetica organization. So, to ensure credibility, third-party evaluations, peer reviews, and external audits should be employed. Gathering feedback from participants and stakeholders helps to identify strengths, weaknesses, and areas for improvement. Transparency is really important. Progress reports, impact assessments, and lessons learned must be regularly published. And public reporting, we know it helps accountability, and it helps build trust with external surveys or external stakeholders. So ultimately, what we're looking for is evidence of systemic change. And this includes increased trust, improved market fairness, more inclusive economic participation, and sustained reductions in corruption over time. So, I would say three key things. Firstly, define the baseline data and set ambitions, but realistic targets. Increasing collective action participation or reducing reported corruption cases are examples of what KPIs could be, and establishing a baseline is quite important. And then combining hard data, number of cases, financial impact, with qualitative insights, so case studies and stakeholder testimonials. And then really using monitoring results to define strategies, scale successful approaches, and help address, these gaps. So to summarize, I think to know if collective action is actually working, we need to set clear goals and KPIs to track both participation and outcomes, use independent assessments, and report transparently. And I think that by embedding these practices, collective action initiatives can be ensured that they are not only well-intentioned, but are truly effective in fighting corruption and driving inclusive growth. Carolyn, thank you.
Thanks, Rhoda. Can I ask you that you just go back to those three things that you said before, right at the end? I just tried to capture them and write them down, but you said them very quickly. So the one...
So it's about KPIs and baselines. So let's establish what the KPIs are. And it's important to understand, what the baseline is. So what is our starting point? And what do we want to get to? Where do we want to get to by when, right? And then it's about having the qualitative data as well as the quantitative data. So that's the second one. So it's the hard number stuff as well as the, the qualitative insights. For example, the studies and stakeholder testimonials. And then the third one is the continuous improvement. So monitoring results, refining the strategies, and scaling successful approaches, I think all helps to address these gaps.
Thanks very much. And that's on a systemic level. Really, we're wanting to see that we're talking B20, G20, so it's at a national level. We're trying to see that systemic move. Thanks so much, Rueda. Fazana, if you could perhaps add to that for us and give us some examples around that, please.
Sure. How long is a piece of string?
Yeah.
It's a fantastic but also a very challenging question, right? Measuring the impact of anti-corruption efforts is notoriously difficult because we're trying to prove a negative, right?
Yeah.
How many corrupt deals didn't happen? That's why it's critical to move beyond just perceptions and focus on what I suggest, a two-pronged approach. The first prong is to measure leading indicators. Or the outputs of our actions. What are we putting into the system? The second and more difficult prong is to measure lagging indicators, which are the actual outcomes and impacts of those actions. So, for example, I refer to the Saudi Etimad platform, the procurement platform. On the output side, we can measure the sheer volume of activity. For instance, the platform has processed hundreds of thousands of payment orders and thousands of government contracts. But the real impact is in the outcomes, right? The digitization of the entire procurement cycle has not only increased transparency, but also delivered a tangible benefit. By using the platform to automate processes and employ AI technologies, the government has been able to save more than 2,250 hours of human effort, which directly translates to increased efficiency. This isn't a perception, it's a measurable outcome of the technology and the collective will to use it. Now I'm going to be a bit not so nice about the South African platform, forgive me. So, in terms of the e-tenders publication portal, on the leading side, it's been incredibly successful. For example, in 2023 and in the fiscal year 2022 and 2023, over 30,000 tenders were advertised on the platform, centralizing a vast number of opportunities, which is a great step for transparency. However, the challenge lies in the lagging indicators. So a recent IMF report pointed out that while the tenders are being advertised, there's a low compliance rate for publishing the bid values of the awarded contracts. For the fiscal year 2022 and 2023, bid values were reported for less than 800 contracts. Right? So if there were 30,000 tenders that were advertised, this is a minimal number of contracts publicized. So this highlights a crucial point for this panel. A tool is only effective as the collective action behind it. The platform for transparency exists, but if the final critical piece of data isn't published, the full benefits of competition and accountability can't be realized. So this leads to the next evolution of our measurement. We must move beyond just counting the tenders and move towards a more proactive, risk-based approach and even involve the public directly. In Brazil, the Office of the Comptroller, as I said, developed this ALICE program, which is an AI tool that analyzes massive data sets of public procurement processes to detect red flags. And on the lagging indicator side, this has had a significant and measurable impact because between 2019 and 2022, ALICE alerts led to the suspension or cancellation of over 9.7 billion reais in bids, with over 1.3 billion reais in financial benefits accounted for. So this tool can, actually demonstrate measurable impact in terms of, the e-procurement tool. So the positive impacts aren't just only for the public sector. It also creates value for private companies because it encourages fairer competition. Honest companies are less likely to be at a disadvantage due to corrupt practices, and focus is shifted to quality of bids and services. It provides them with increased access to opportunities like the e-tender procurement process, which is a single, easy to access location to find thousands of government business opportunities. And it also helps to reduce delays and increase efficiencies. So ultimately, measuring the impact of our anti-corruption efforts is a journey. It's not easy. And I think with platforms or like the B20 and the G20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force and other, OECD, UNGC initiatives, etc. We can all help in, trying to identify tangible, measurable KPIs that can help us to, to get quantifiable outcomes. And that's not to prove that we just, not that we're busy, but we're making a real difference in creating a more inclusive and prosperous future for all.
Carolyn, if I just may add to that, I mean, I'm also watching the chat, and there's a couple of comments and around fraud and corruption in public sector. I guess I just want to challenge the audience in, and we need to break down this myth that corruption is a public sector problem, right? Yes, there's corruption in public sector, but there's also significant corruption in the private sector. And so when we talk about collective action, this is about the private sector working with the public sector, and as well as society to combat fraud and corruption. And I think that's really important. And PPPs themselves, if designed well, and I guess that's what the point is that Fazana was making, is that they can help, if they're designed well, they can help anti-corruption safeguards and embed anti-corruption safeguards, such as open contracting and third-party oversight into projects and procurement. And I think that, when designed well, PPPs should deter corruption, reduce regulatory capture, and build public trust. And importantly, PPPs can also be structured to ensure that local businesses, small and medium enterprises, and others have access to opportunities. And what this does is it broadens the benefits of growth and helps ensure that economic development is therefore truly inclusive. PPPs, again, if designed well, also facilitate knowledge transfer and technical assistance, helping public institutions and smaller businesses improve their ability to prevent, detect and address corruption. And so, in our policy paper, we definitely believe that PPPs needs to be designed well, but they can promote integrity and inclusive growth. But again, it requires both the public sector and the private sector, to work together in combating corruption.
Thank you so much, Rookie Era. I was on mute. I've just launched the poll, and let's just have a look at what the audience is saying about whether they believe the benefits of PPP outweigh the risks. And certainly 50% of our audience our attendees say yes, the benefits do outweigh the risks, but we've still got a large percentage saying, I'm not sure. And I think that's what you're talking about, Rweda, is that if it's designed well, and that's what Fazana, you were saying, it's not good enough just to have the facility there. You actually have to have the whole design around it with the leading and the lagging indicators, just to make sure that it provides a comprehensive, cohesive solution to PPP. But certainly, as you're saying, Rweda, it is an effective tool if used properly. So I think it's good insights. Thanks very much to everybody who participated. We've got a lot of questions, both in the Q&A as well as on the chat. Are there any that stand out for you?
I think for me, the point of working together with the private sector and the point that has been raised that it's not only in government, but we find these challenges also in the private sector as really a big point for us to note. And we can only curb this through collective action. And I'm pleased that this is one of the recommendations of the policy paper. And with all the different stakeholders and members that have contributed to the policy paper, it's definitely something that we can be considered going forward and what sort of action can be done.
Yeah, and sorry, Rita.
Carry on,
Go
carry
ahead,
on.
Sana.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. We can't just lay the blame on the public sector. For example, in the arms deal, who were the bribers, right? It was private sector, right? And mostly European companies that come from countries that have low corruption rates. So it's that's why I think we can't just focus on the public sector. We have to have collective action, which includes not just the private sector, the public sector, but also civil society, right? And only with all three, with all of us working together, will we be able to make a dent into what seems to be an impossible task. And I saw there was a question about petty corruption, and I've been fortunate to have been able to work in many multinationals with large resources. But what about the SMEs, right? The small and medium enterprise companies. How do they effectively tackle corruption? I've had many lives, and one of my previous lives, I worked at Maersk, the container shipping company. And, I think Rueda mentioned the Collective Action Network, MACN, which Maersk was one of the founding members. And, they, together with other leading shipping companies, now today, I think there's over 200 members, were able to use collective action to stop facilitation payments, for example, in the Suez Canal, which we used to call the Marlboro Canal, because they used to use cartons of Marlboro cigarettes to pay the facilitation payments. But they were also successful in countries like Nigeria, Argentina, Bangladesh, right? But these are huge companies that have significant market clout. What about the SMEs? How do you use collective action to combat corruption with limited resources? And I've got 3 suggestions. 1, join existing networks. The SMEs can join established collective action initiatives like the MACN. By becoming a member, even a small company gains access to a large, powerful network and its resources, including standardized compliance tools, best practices, reporting mechanisms. So you don't need to build it from scratch, you just need to join a community. 2, leverage the digital platforms. The same digital tools we've discussed today, like the e-tenders portal, are powerful tools for SMEs. It reduces the need for physical interaction and face-to-face negotiations, which are often a gateway to corruption. And, if you do have the resources to digitize your own processes and rely on government e-procurement platforms, you can reduce the exposure to corrupt requests. And thirdly, form industry alliances. If an established network doesn't exist, SMEs can create their own. I think Rueda mentioned Samlet and a few others. If you don't have an industry network, create your own. For example, construction companies or retailers, etc. In my previous life, I was at IBM. When I was with IBM in South Africa, I formed a compliance network with Shell and Cecil, and our membership quickly grew to around 30 companies, including multinationals like Siemens, GE, Vodacom, Walmart, etc. because we had the same challenges, especially when it came to abiding to international anti-corruption laws, because our companies had to abide to laws like the UK Bribery Act or the FCPA. And this was a great forum to discuss compliance challenges and exchange best practices. I'm not sure if this network still exists, but my suggestion to SMEs is to create something similar to address their compliance or ethical challenges. The compliance community is very collaborative, and I've been part of compliance networks in the Netherlands, in Copenhagen, and in Saudi Arabia. So if you do need support and assistance, compliance officers are usually readily available and helpful. I think South Africa, and I think, Carolyn, you probably have more information on this, but has this National Business Initiative, NBI, which I think was launched by Nelson Mandela, which can also, I think help with addressing issues like corruption. And I think in the Middle East, there is the Pearl Initiative, which is a similar initiative to the MBI. And I'm going to plug the Good Governance Academy. Carolyn, you can pay me later. You can pay me later in Biltong when I come to the B20.
Oh, no, that's a facilitation fee.
For SMEs, organizations like the Good Governance Academy, it's a fantastic resource, right? As a global nonprofit, it offers free webinars like this one, a wealth of other resources focused on promoting transparency and ethical leadership. So you may not have the individual clout of large corporations, but your power lies in your numbers and collaboration. Join existing networks like the NBI, Pearl Initiative, take advantage of the GGA, leverage digital platforms, and form your own industry alliances. Through this collective action, you not only protect your own business, but also contribute to a more ethical and competitive market to everyone. And finally, I want to say Happy Heritage Day tomorrow. I'll be wearing my Springbok cap in celebration. And thanks for having me on this panel.
Thank you so much, Fazana. You speak about transparency, and there's lots of points on the on the side, on the chat around transparency. And there is a question from Makale. I just want to get to their question here, just in terms of whistleblowers. So on the other side, you have transparency where there's a lack of transparency, where there's a complete sense of frustration, and finally there's the act of whistleblowing, and we see the detrimental consequences of all a lot of whistleblowers in terms of how they're blowing the whistle. What are your comments around, maybe just start with you, Fazana, and then go to Rueda. What are your comments around whistleblowing?
So in terms of the compliance programs that I've helped to develop in my various lives, one of the key components is around protecting whistleblowers, right? If a whistleblower doesn't feel comfortable in reporting something because of retaliation, and it's not just in terms of losing their job, it could be also, and we've seen examples in South Africa, where people have lost their lives when they've blown the whistle. So, it's, unless we can have a mechanism to protect our whistleblowers, not only in terms of anonymity and keeping what they've provided us confidential. I don't feel that I could recommend people to blow the whistle unless we have those safeguards and mechanisms in place, right? So that's key to any, to any program, is to ensure that we are able to protect our whistleblowers. If we can't, then we shouldn't be encouraging people to speak up.
Thank you. Rowena, you got a way in there?
Just before, I recall an example of a speak up case that I received, and it was anonymous, and the person said, not only am I afraid for my career, I'm also afraid for my life. And I personally, usually it was another department that would do the investigation, but in this matter, I personally wanted to lead it to just ensure that, we didn't know who the whistleblower was at that stage, but through elimination, we could identify, who it could have been. And we did the investigation. We were able to substantiate it, and key individuals in that organization were terminated, were fired, and the CEO was demoted. He wasn't involved in the issue, but because it was during his tenure, he was demoted to another role. And what that showed, after that, there was a flood of whistleblower reports because the employees realized that they would be protected, the matter would be investigated, and thirdly, action would be taken, even if it was a senior employee, right? So if we can get that right, I think we can be successful in our whistleblowing efforts.
It's what Cash Kavadia said in his video. It's the trust, building trust, really important. Sorry, Rowena?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so look, I'm a stats person. Statistically, corruption and fraud is identified mostly through whistleblowing reports, right? It's not through external audit. It's not through internal audit. It's not through risk assessment. Statistically, the most fraud is actually identified through anonymous tip-offs or whistleblowing mechanisms. And that's, you can't, the facts don't lie. And so it is critically important, as Fazana says, that we do have protection mechanisms in place to protect our whistleblowers. There are just far too many examples, particularly here in South Africa. The most recent case just, 4 weeks ago, where a person lost their life, as someone, an attorney who was investigating a scheme, was killed. And yet, this is one of the mechanisms that is real in reducing and identifying fraud and corruption. Now, in theory, we all talk about the fraud triangle. And this is where I do remind, I guess, the private sector that, for every fraud that is committed, there is also, another individual enabling the fraud or agreeing to pay the bribe or the facilitation fee, right? So we as the private sector, I always say we need to be careful that we don't kind of say this is a public sector issue. And that's why I always, I guess, challenge the private sector. What is our role in enabling this environment, this corrupt environment that we find ourselves in? So I do believe that whistleblowing as a mechanism to detect fraud is real. And, again, I would encourage those on the call, again, just to do practical things like reevaluating whistleblowing processes, making sure that we are able to protect the whistleblowers, and saying, what can we do in our organizations to protect whistleblowers, through various mechanisms. And then the last thing that I want to say, not necessarily just on whistleblowing itself, but on fraud and corruption, is that we're in an age where we have the ability through technology to make a substantial impact in reducing fraud and corruption, across the board. With the use of digital tools, AI, etc., we're suddenly in a place where, you can offer not just whistleblowing protection mechanisms, but, using digitization to really, understand where the fraud is happening and to get to, the root of it. So where it's systemic fraud or corruption, what technology allows us to do through various tools that are out there. And I know it's not the subject of necessarily this conversation, because it is another recommendation of the Integrity and Compliance Task Force, but certainly we're in this digital age, right? And so there are many mechanisms that we can use to detect and prevent fraud, through technology, and we should lean in as far as possible in making sure that that happens.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's a question here from Anrud around really the culture of it. So, and Dudu, I'm going to ask you, because although you weren't in the leadership team, you have been behind the scenes and supporting this team and putting these papers together. Was there any work on the cultural side of things? Did some papers come up, or some people talk about the cultural aspects of this?
I'd say a lot more was on the technology side, and I'm very glad that our chair, Rueda, brought that point in. And looking at the generation that we're in right now, we've got a lot. I mean, some of us are in professions where there are a lot of young people joining the organizations. And if you look at from uni level, where there's a lot of AI, and a lot of that, even in the policy paper, there was a lot of commentary on the use of technology. And I look at it and say, if you look at the comments, they were all talking about it's government, it's top leadership, but we have to be instilling that kind of culture where even the young people getting into organizations understand that we have to change this trajectory of corruption in terms of how we behave, quite honestly. So it's an important point that we should not overlook, that from the slightest slip, it starts with a very small habit, and organizations should be instilling values where knowing that there will be an outcome for the smallest sense of injustice that is done, because that is how we will be really defining the future. Otherwise, we will keep on years, decades later, talking about the same. I've seen comments here, people saying, how do we...
Nothing new.
Nothing new, indeed. So from a culture perspective, I would definitely say that organizations, the leadership, that's very important to drive that and instill that, especially for the young people that are joining our organizations.
Here's a difficult one, and it's come through as a little bit of a stream through a theme through here. And I'm going to use the young people's terms. What happens when people throw shade? When actually it's unfounded, and now careers are destroyed through throwing shade. Have you got any wise words, Fazana, Rueda?
Yeah, I think, so let me come to that, right? Because to expand on what Dudu said, I do believe, and just looking at some of the people on the call, that as leaders, there are a lot of leaders on the call, it also starts with the tone at the top, right? So what tone are we setting from a culture point of view? When something is reported through an anonymous tip-offs line, for example, or if someone, walks into my office as the CEO, wanting to report behavior that, does not align with the values of the organization, how do we as leaders react to that? Do we try to sweep it under the carpet because of the impact that this may have on my own career, or because the board is going to ask me a question about it? Or do we say, let's get to the root cause of the issue, and let's do an investigation? And it then touches on the question, I guess, you are asking, Carolyn. I'm a little older, so I don't necessarily understand this generational stuff that you're talking about, throwing shade. But I believe that, let's take the tip-offs line, right? You do get a number of cases that are reported where you have a disgruntled employee, and so an allegation is made. I think it's really important that every allegation is taken seriously, that every case is investigated, that we try to get to the bottom of what the underlying issue is, and thereafter we, take the action that is necessary. And in doing so, certainly in our organization, where someone has behaved inappropriately or has acted in a way that is not aligned with our values, or has been involved in some fraud or corrupt activities, we make it well known that this is not acceptable behavior. And in doing so, we start setting a different culture where, this is not accepted. And the reality is, unfortunately, in South Africa, we almost have a culture that, if you want things done faster, or you're driving on the highway and you get pulled over by a police officer because you've been doing more than 120, it is acceptable, right? Because it's been done every single time. It is acceptable to pay the person 100 rand or whatever it is, and for you to get on your way. And that behavior shouldn't be acceptable to us. Even 100 rand, even paying a bribe of 5 rand, whatever, is not acceptable. And that's the culture that we should be building, in our organizations, that there is zero tolerance for fraud and corruption and unethical behavior.
A silly story I remember, and Frazan, we'll get to you, but I remember talking to somebody in Germany and say, well, what happens to you if you drive without a license? So, and he went, you don't drive without a license. No, but what happens if you are driving without a license? No, we don't drive without licenses. No, we don't. It's the culture. Frazana?
Yeah, when I was in Germany, I used to get sworn at if I crossed the street and the green man wasn't on. I was always
don't do that.
Yeah, I was always late for work. So, if there weren't any cars, I'd just run across and there would be these angry German ladies screaming at me for not waiting for the green man. I think, talking about shade, and I think we've seen it recently at the Coldplay concert, right? Where you had the CEO, there was evidence misbehaving. But in terms of that, right, it was apparently well known in the organization that the CEO had a relationship with with the HR lady, right? And I'm sure it could have either been reported, but the fact is, even though it was well known, no action was taken until the global community, there was shade, to use the right. But so that, I guess, is one of the mechanisms to effect change, is to publish things on social media, which I think is happening more and more. But there's also a danger, right? Because and especially I think in this cancel culture, if you are going to be making allegations that are unfounded, and once it's out there, it's got a life of its own, and it could be quite damaging, to the person that is being accused, without following a proper and robust process to understand if those allegations are substantiated. So, I think there's good and there's also bad. But, I think it's, giving the example of, the CEO, if that company had a good whistleblowing or ethical culture, I think that could have been addressed earlier and in a much better way than it had been.
Yeah,
absolutely. I can't believe we've run out of time. I still got so many questions to get to. This has been so exciting, so interesting. I think we've just got a fabulous panel. Ruwaida, thank you so much for joining us. As chairs of the task force, I think it's been a fantastic outcome. Certainly the paper is so valuable, and I really urge everyone online to download the paper. I put the link to all the papers, but specifically this task force paper. It's really been a tremendous outcome of a year of hard work. And Fazana, thank you so much for co-chairing, for coming online today and giving your insights, the practical insights, and just showing, what's happening in Saudi Arabia versus what's happening in South Africa. Giving us that perspective has been very, very insightful. Thank you very much for that. And Dudu behind the scenes and getting these webinars sorted out and getting us up and running has been tremendous. So thank you so much for your help with the Good Governance Academy and with these webinars. So thank you, but once again, it's been fabulous being part of this task force myself and for being part of the B20 South Africa. It's been lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining us online. Bye then.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.